Hello Internet and welcome to this week's edition of 1 Minute News from 1 Minute Economics, an edition through which I'm going to analyze the recent NATO and G7 reunions from the perspective of an economist. And I'm going to do it relatively quickly by one, explaining the message that the Trump administration has tried to get across to other NATO members, two, understanding why and how things have deteriorated between the US and Europe, with the most obvious example being the relationship between the United States and Germany, and finally, three, drawing the line and realizing that the first two dimensions lead us to the same conclusion. I'm going to start by sharing an image which makes it clear that the US is spending disproportionately more than other NATO members on defense. 3.6% of its GDP to be more precise. Now this can be because one, other NATO members are not spending enough, or two, because the US is simply spending way more money than it should on defense. Now, the Trump administration tends to think that the answer is number one, and to be accurate, while Trump has been the most vocal president about this is by no means a Trump thing, and other presidents, including Barack Obama, have made it clear, even if in more diplomatic terms, that other NATO members need to spend more on defense. Now, if we also take into account that the US has the largest GDP out of all NATO members, then it becomes even more clear how things stand. I mean, look, if we take how much all NATO members spend per year as a total on defense, we land at $918.3 billion, whereas the US alone spends $664.1 billion per year. So the US alone spends over 70% of how much all NATO members spend combined. And for this reason, pretty much all administrations firmly believe that NATO needs to step up and that other members need to start spending more money on defense. The second dimension revolves around the fact that the relationship between the US and Europe has obviously deteriorated, and the most eloquent example is how things stand between the United States and Germany. Chancellor Merkel, for example, who is otherwise pretty reserved, has made it clear that in her opinion, the days in which the two parties could blindly rely on one another are pretty much over. Now, this means, to phrase it differently, that Europe may just have to take its destiny into its own hands. But the question is, can it? For example, one dimension of it all would be for Europe to create its own army. But I'm going to share some figures which prove that as it is, European countries are not very good at allocating money to defense. So under these circumstances, it remains to be seen just how much wiggle room there is. But it may very well be the case that the European Union won't have a choice. From being tougher on trade to building its own army and so on, these things seem to be developing, and it's not a pretty sight, but unfortunately, it may just be what we'll be referring to as reality from now on. Finally, I believe the two dimensions ultimately lead us to the same conclusion. The fact that, whether by choice or because it was forced to, Europe will end up being more proactive and taking matters into its own hands. Unfortunately, however, all of this will probably cost a lot of money. And Germany, for example, will most likely be able to adapt relatively quickly, but the same thing cannot be said about other countries. And I'm going to share some data right now related to the debt to GDP levels of various European Union members. And all in all, let's just say it's going to be a lot easier for some countries to adapt than for others. As sad as this state of affairs may be, the European Union is crippled by a lot of problems. The debt to GDP ratios represent one dimension. Then there's also the improper level of competitiveness. Then there's also the high unemployment rate in general and youth unemployment rate in particular, and the list could go on and on. And it's easy to talk about how Europe is going to build its own army, about how Europe is going to take its destiny into its own hands and so on when you're doing so from the position of Germany. But it becomes a lot harder when you think about the fact that Greece needs to also be added into the mix with its high employment, youth unemployment, huge debt to GDP ratio and so on. And all in all, something that looks good on paper or that sounds very good politically speaking may end up being excruciatingly hard to implement in the real world. That's it for today, guys. Thanks a lot for tuning in to yet another edition of 1 Minute News from 1 Minute Economics. And as always, please like my videos, comment, and subscribe to 1 Minute Economics if you haven't by now. Also, those of you who want to support the channel by buying my book, by donating through PayPal, Bitcoin, Patreon, and so on, can find out more about how this can be done by heading over to 1minuteeconomics.com. Thanks a lot, guys, and have an awesome week.